I turned 72 the day my son Thomas abandoned me at Evergreen Meadows. No birthday wishes, no goodbye. Just the rumble of his luxury sedan and the sting of silence as he drove away without looking back. He thought he had all the power when he walked out of my life. I thought that was the end of my story. But I was wrong. 1 week later, a forgotten letter would flip everything on its head and make my son wish he'd never left me behind. On the morning of my 72nd birthday, I stood in the rain outside Evergreen Meadows assisted living, a small worn suitcase at my feet, and my late husband's cardigan pulled tight around my shoulders. Thomas, my only son, remained in his luxury sedan, engine running, his attention fixed on his smartwatch. No happy birthday, no embrace. Just they have your paperwork, before he popped the trunk and waited for me to unload my own bag. I tried to smile to keep my dignity intact, but my hands trembled as I lifted that pitiful suitcase myself. I never thought it would end like this, not with Thomas, not after everything. Before we continue, drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more powerful stories of resilience and redemption. Evergreen Meadows wasn't terrible. It had freshly painted cream walls and artificial plants strategically placed in corners, the kind that collect dust but never wilt. A receptionist with tired eyes greeted me with a clipboard. "Room 317, she said without looking up. Thomas handed her a folder. "She forgets her medication sometimes," he said matter-of-factly. Then he turned to leave. That was it. 37 years of motherhood reduced to a clinical handoff. He didn't even say goodbye. I stood frozen, clutching a plastic bag of toiletries, as if I were already a ghost in my own life. The receptionist led me down a long hallway that smelled of disinfectant and overcooked vegetables. Other residents shuffled past, their eyes vacant, their movements slow. Was this what I had become? Another anonymous elderly woman filed away and forgotten? Room 317 was small but clean, a single bed with tightly tucked corners, a nightstand with a lamp that gave off harsh light, and a window overlooking the parking lot. I watched Thomas's car pull away, disappearing down the road without even a backward glance. I sank onto the bed, the springs creaking beneath me. The truth I'd been avoiding for months finally settled in my chest like concrete. My son, the baby I'd nursed through fevers, the boy I'd cheered at every baseball game, the young man whose college tuition I'd scraped together by working 2 jobs, had discarded me like outdated furniture. What I didn't know then, as tears slid silently down my cheeks, was that fate had something extraordinary waiting just around the corner, something that would forever change both our lives. Before Evergreen Meadows, before the silence grew between us, I lived in a modest yellow bungalow with a garden full of sunflowers and a porch swing that creaked in the wind. Frank and I had bought it when Thomas was just 3 years old, a place to raise our son and grow old together. When Frank passed unexpectedly from a heart attack 15 years ago, Thomas had stepped up, becoming the man of the house at just 22. "Don't worry, Mom," he'd said, holding my hand at the funeral. "I'll take care of everything now." And for a while, he did. I continued my work as an elementary school art teacher, finding solace in the chaos of children's laughter and colorful paint splatters. Every Sunday, Thomas would visit, sometimes with laundry tucked under his arm, other times with groceries I hadn't asked for. "Just making sure you're eating right," he'd say, unpacking organic produce that cost more than my weekly budget allowed. I let him do it. It made him feel good, made me feel loved. I was so proud of him. My Thomas, with his business degree and startup company that specialized in financial technology. He wore tailored suits and cologne that smelled like cedar and ambition. When we went out for dinner, he always grabbed the check. "Your days of taking care of me are over, Mom," he'd say with a wink. I believed him. I truly did. Even when his visits became less frequent, his calls shorter, I told myself it was normal. He was building something important, dating a marketing executive named Vanessa who wore stiletto heels and never ate carbs. They were busy people with busy lives. I adjusted. I learned to eat dinner alone at my kitchen table, to laugh at television shows instead of across from someone I loved. I told my colleagues at school that Thomas was just busy, not distant. There's a difference. Or so I thought. The first real crack appeared on a warm Thursday afternoon. I'd been diagnosed with mild hypertension. Nothing serious, just something to watch. I called Thomas after my doctor's appointment, thinking he might be concerned. "That's why you need to move somewhere with staff, Mom," he said immediately, his voice clipped and distracted by whatever was on his computer screen. "What if you had a real emergency and no one was there?" "It's just blood pressure," I replied, surprised by his reaction. "Dr. Miller says it's manageable with diet and—" "You're getting older," he cut in. "We need to be realistic about your situation." My situation. As if my life had become a problem to solve rather than a journey to respect. After that call, something shifted between us. Thomas started scrutinizing everything. How I kept my house, what I ate, whether I'd paid my bills on time. During one visit, he noticed unpaid mail on the counter and immediately assumed I was slipping. "I was going to open those tomorrow," I explained. "I've been busy with the school's art exhibition." He sighed heavily. "This is exactly what I'm talking about. You're forgetting important things." I wasn't forgetting. I was prioritizing differently than he would. But my explanations fell on deaf ears. The worst came during a dinner with Vanessa and her parents at an upscale restaurant downtown. When I couldn't immediately figure out how to use the restaurant's digital menu on a tablet, Thomas laughed nervously. "Technology is really leaving Mom behind," he said to the table. Last week, she tried to write a check at the grocery store and held up the entire line. Everyone chuckled politely. I smiled too, but something inside me crumpled. The check story wasn't even true. I'd simply asked a cashier for help with the chip reader, but that didn't matter. In Thomas's new narrative, I had become the doddering old woman who couldn't keep up with the modern world. I excused myself to the restroom and stared at my reflection. When had I become a punchline in my son's stories? The decision to put me in Evergreen Meadows didn't arrive with shouting or tears. It slipped in quietly on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon when Thomas stopped by unannounced, a glossy brochure in hand. "I found a really nice place," he said casually, sliding the brochure across my kitchen table. "Great amenities, full-time medical staff, social activities." I stared at the smiling seniors on the cover, playing cards and walking through manicured gardens. "I'm not ready for something like this, Thomas." He pursed his lips. "Mom, we've talked about this. Your doctor mentioned those memory lapses. I forgot one appointment," I said, feeling heat rise in my cheeks. "It doesn't mean I can't live independently." Thomas ran his hand through his perfectly styled hair. "The house is too much for you. The stairs, the maintenance, and you're isolated here." "I have friends," I countered. "My book club, my former colleagues." He didn't seem to hear me. "Vanessa and I are thinking of starting a family soon. We need to know you're somewhere safe." The subtext was clear. I was becoming an inconvenience to the life he was building. My existence was a loose end he needed to tie up neatly. 2 days later, he called to tell me they had an opening at Evergreen Meadows. "Just for a trial period," he assured me. "The timing works perfectly. They can take you on your birthday." My birthday. As if being abandoned was some sort of gift. I wanted to argue, to remind him of the woman I still was, the mother who had once been his entire world. But the weariness of fighting to be seen, truly seen, had settled deep in my bones. "Fine," I said quietly. "I'll try it." His relief was palpable even through the phone. "Great! I'll pick you up at 9. Pack light. Your room won't be very big." Just like that, 72 years of living reduced to whatever could fit in a suitcase that wouldn't inconvenience my son. Life at Evergreen Meadows settled into a numbing routine. Breakfast at 7:30, lumpy oatmeal and weak coffee. Morning activities, bingo or watercolor classes where we painted the same bowl of fruit week after week, lunch at noon, afternoon television in the common room, dinner at 5:30, then medications and early bedtime. Days blurred together. My roommate Eleanor rarely spoke, content to stare out the window for hours. The staff meant well but were overworked and harried, learning our names but never our stories. Thomas didn't call that first week. No birthday card arrived. I sat by the phone in the common area each afternoon, pretending to read while hoping it would ring. It was on the 8th day, while sorting through the few possessions I'd brought, that I found it, a crumpled envelope at the bottom of my suitcase. Inside was a letter from my late husband's attorney, Mr. Jacobson. I'd completely forgotten about it, having received it just days before Thomas moved me here. "Dear Mrs. Carter," it began, "it is my duty to inform you that the property investment your husband made in Cedar Grove 30 years ago has finally been approved for commercial development. As the sole beneficiary, you are entitled to the proceeds of the sale, amounting to $2.4 million after taxes." I read the letter 3 times, my hands trembling. Frank had mentioned buying some land once, saying it might be worth something someday. I'd assumed Thomas knew about it. Frank had taught him everything about investing. But reading further, I realized Frank had kept this particular investment quiet, a secret safety net just for me. Mr. Jacobson requested I contact him to arrange the transfer of funds. There was a number to call, forms to sign. I sat on my narrow bed, the letter clutched to my chest. After months of feeling powerless, fate had handed me back the reins to my own life. For the first time since arriving at Evergreen Meadows, I smiled. Not the polite, empty smile I'd been wearing, but one filled with the warmth of possibility. I didn't call Thomas, not yet. First, I needed a plan. The next morning, I asked to use the facility's phone in private. The administrator, Mrs. Jenkins, raised an eyebrow but led me to her office. "Take your time, Mrs. Carter," she said, closing the door behind her. My call to Mr. Jacobson was brief but productive. Yes, the money was real. Yes, it was all mine. No, Thomas had no legal claim to it. We arranged for me to visit his office the following week to sign the necessary paperwork. "And Mrs. Carter," Mr. Jacobson added before hanging up, "Frank would be pleased to know this is helping you. He always said you deserved the world." Next, I called my old friend Diana, who'd been texting me daily since my trial stay began. "Can you pick me up tomorrow around 10?" I asked. "I need to run an errand." With Diana's help, I visited 3 banks the next day. At the third, I found what I was looking for, a financial advisor named Patricia who didn't speak to me like I was a child. She helped me set up accounts that only I could access, with clear legal instructions that no family member could make claims without my explicit consent. "It's more common than you think," Patricia said kindly as I signed the forms. "Many women your age are taking control of their finances after years of letting others handle things." I didn't mention that this was money Thomas didn't even know existed. That would be my secret for now. Back at Evergreen Meadows, I began researching on the shared computer during quiet hours. I looked at apartments in Lakeside Gardens, a beautiful independent living community across town. I researched volunteer opportunities at the art museum. I even found a watercolor class taught by a real artist, not a well-meaning activities coordinator. For the first time in years, I felt like Margaret Carter again, not just Thomas's mother or Frank's widow, but a woman with agency and dreams of her own. 1 week after discovering the letter, I finally called my son. Thomas answered on the 4th ring, sounding distracted as usual. "Mom? Is everything okay at Evergreen?" "We need to talk," I said, my voice steadier than it had been in months. "Can you come by tomorrow?" There was a pause, the sound of him covering the phone to speak to someone else. "I have meetings until 6. I could stop by around 7. 7 works," I replied, then hung up before he could ask questions. The next evening, I dressed carefully in my best slacks and a blue blouse that brought out my eyes. I applied lipstick and a touch of the perfume Frank had given me on our last anniversary. I wasn't trying to impress Thomas. I was reminding myself of who I was. He arrived at 7:15, looking harried. "Sorry I'm late," he said, glancing around my small room with barely concealed discomfort. "Traffic was terrible. How are you settling in?" "Let's walk," I suggested, ignoring his question. "There's a small garden out back." The evening air was cool as we strolled past carefully tended flower beds. Other residents nodded as we passed, some watching with curious eyes. Thomas filled the silence with chatter about his work, Vanessa's promotion, their plans to renovate their kitchen. I waited until we reached a stone bench beside a small fountain before I spoke. "I'm leaving Evergreen Meadows, Thomas." He stopped mid-sentence about granite countertops. "What? Mom, we agreed this was the best place for you. You can't just—" "I can," I interrupted gently. "And I will. I found a lovely apartment at Lakeside Gardens. I move in next week." His face flushed. "That place is expensive. You can't afford—" "I've come into some money," I said simply. "An investment your father made has matured." Thomas's expression shifted from confusion to calculation so quickly, it broke my heart a little. "Dad's investment? What investment? Why didn't you tell me?" "For the same reason you didn't consult me before deciding my life belonged in this place," I replied, keeping my voice level. "You made assumptions about what was best for me without seeing me as a person capable of making my own choices." Thomas's face paled as my words hit home. He opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again. "How much?" he finally asked. I smiled sadly. "That's what you want to know? Not whether I'm happy here, not whether I miss my home or my garden or my independence, just how much money is involved." He had the decency to look ashamed. "Mom, 2.4 million, I said quietly. "After taxes." His eyes widened. "And you've just been sitting on this information? We could have invested it, grown it, I could have—" "That's exactly why I didn't tell you," I cut in. "Your first thought wasn't for my welfare, but for what you could do with the money." Thomas sank onto the bench beside me, his expensive suit wrinkling. For the first time in years, he actually looked at me. Not through me, not around me, but at me. "I thought I was doing the right thing," he said softly. "You seemed, I don't know, smaller somehow. More fragile." "Because that's what you needed to see," I replied. It was easier to think of me as declining than to acknowledge I was simply changing, growing older but not lesser. We sat in silence for several minutes, the fountain bubbling beside us. In the distance, an elderly man walked with his daughter, their heads bent toward each other in easy conversation. I wondered if Thomas and I would ever find that comfort again. "I've made arrangements," I continued finally. "I've set up a trust for my care, should I ever truly need it. I've also established a small foundation to fund art programs for children." Thomas looked up sharply. "You did all this yourself? Without telling me?" "Yes," I said simply. "Just as you made arrangements for me without my input." The irony wasn't lost on him. He ran his hands through his hair, mussing its perfect style. "I really messed up, didn't I?" It wasn't a question that needed answering. My apartment at Lakeside Gardens had large windows that filled the rooms with light. From my balcony, I could see the actual lake, where residents walked along a winding path or sat on benches with books and coffee. My furniture, the pieces Thomas hadn't yet sorted through, was delivered the day I moved in. Diana helped me unpack, exclaiming over how perfect my quilted throw looked on the new sofa. "This place suits you, Margaret," she said, arranging my art supplies on the desk by the window. "It has your spirit." I agreed. Here, I wasn't a patient or a burden. I was a resident with my own door key, my own kitchen, my own schedule. The community offered activities, but no one infantilized us with mandatory crafts or bedtimes. We were adults who had chosen to live in a community, not be managed by one. Thomas called 3 times that first week. Our conversations were stilted, cautious. He asked about my apartment, my neighbors, whether I needed anything. I answered politely but didn't invite him to visit. Not yet. We both needed time to rediscover who we were to each other now that the power dynamic had shifted. On my 1-month anniversary at Lakeside, I received a package. Inside was a leather-bound sketchbook and a set of professional watercolors, the expensive kind I'd always admired but never bought for myself. The card read simply, "I'm sorry. When you're ready, I'd like to see your paintings. Love, Thomas." It wasn't forgiveness, not quite yet, but it was a beginning. That afternoon, I took my new supplies to the lake and began painting the horizon, the point where water meets sky. I'd forgotten how much I loved the feeling of a brush in my hand, the way colors blended and transformed on paper. A young woman stopped to watch, her toddler balanced on her hip. "That's beautiful," she said. "You're really talented." I thanked her, this stranger who saw me as an artist first, an elderly woman second. We chatted about the lake, about her daughter who was just starting to show interest in colors and shapes. "I teach children's art classes," I told her, surprising myself with the declaration. "Or I used to anyway." "They're looking for instructors at the community center," she mentioned. "You should apply." I nodded, already imagining a room full of children with paintbrushes and unlimited potential. That evening, I called Thomas. "I'd like you to come for dinner next Sunday," I said when he answered. "There's someone I want you to meet." "Who?" he asked, confusion in his voice. "Me," I replied simply. "The real me. It's time we got reacquainted." Thomas arrived for dinner exactly on time, a bouquet of sunflowers in hand. My favorites, though I was surprised he remembered. He'd come straight from work but had removed his tie, an uncharacteristically casual gesture for my always polished son. My apartment smelled of garlic and rosemary, Frank's old pasta recipe simmering on the stove. I'd set the table with my good dishes, rescued from storage, and placed my newest painting on the easel in the corner. "This place is really nice, Mom," Thomas said, looking around with genuine appreciation. "It suits you." "Thank you," I replied, taking the flowers. "I think so too." Dinner was different from our usual strained interactions. Thomas asked about my painting, my new friends at Lakeside, the children's art class I'd been invited to teach. I found myself telling him stories about my students, about the lake at different times of day, about the book club I'd joined. "You seem happier," he observed as I served coffee and the apple crumble I'd baked that morning. "I am," I admitted. Being seen for who I am rather than what someone fears I might become makes a difference. He flinched slightly but nodded. "I've been thinking a lot about that, about how I..." He paused, searching for words. "How I starting seeing the potential problems instead of the actual person." "Your father did the same thing sometimes," I said, surprising us both with the comparison. "He worried so much about providing for us that he sometimes forgot to just be with us." Thomas looked up sharply. "I never thought of it that way." "He was a good man," I continued. "Just like you're a good man. Good intentions don't always lead to good decisions, though." The conversation shifted then, becoming more honest than we'd been in years. Thomas admitted how his fears about my aging had been more about his own mortality than my capabilities. I acknowledged that I'd sometimes encouraged his protective instincts because it was easier than asserting my independence. As he was leaving, Thomas paused by the easel. "Would you..." He hesitated. "Would you consider doing a painting for my office? Vanessa and I redecorated, and there's this empty wall that needs something special." I smiled. "I'd like that." He hugged me then, a real embrace, not the perfunctory gesture he'd been offering for years. "I'm sorry, Mom," he whispered against my hair. "I got it all so wrong." "We both did," I replied, stepping back to look at him, really look at the man my son had become, flaws and all. "But we get to start again. That's the gift we're giving each other." Thomas nodded, tears in his eyes. "Same time next Sunday?" "I'll be here," I promised. "We both will." As I closed the door behind him, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. The journey from that rainy morning at Evergreen Meadows to tonight had been unexpected and at times painful, but it had led us here, to a new understanding, a second chance at the relationship we both deserved. Sometimes being discarded is just the beginning of being found again. Sometimes what looks like an ending is really just a door opening to something better. And sometimes the people who hurt us the most are the ones who, given the chance, can love us the best. The money hadn't changed everything, but it had changed enough. It had given me the power to reclaim my voice, my space, my identity. And in doing so, it had given Thomas the chance to see me again, not as a problem to solve or a burden to bear, but as Margaret Carter, artist, mother, woman still very much alive in her own story.